My name is Kate Paisani, and I am the new CARLA director. Still getting my feet wet, but I'm happy to see all of you. We have a really good series of talks lined up this semester. I think we're doing 4 this semester, 5 this semester, so this is the first. And I just want to make a quick plug for the second one, which will be 2 weeks from today, same time, same place, and I'll be presenting some of my own work at that, so I hope we'll see you there. But today the focus is on Elaine Tarone and Shawna Wicker, our presenters. Elaine requires probably almost no introduction, but I will introduce her anyway. She is recently retired from her position as Distinguished Teaching Professor and Director of CARLA here at the U. She's published extensively on many areas in second language acquisition, including learner language, which she'll talk about today. And she has been a generous and supportive colleague to new CARLA directors, for instance, and a mentor to numerous graduate students, including Shawna Wicker, who has been working with her on the Learner Languages project. Shawna is a graduate student here at the U. She's getting an MA in the TESOL program with a minor in Hispanic linguistics. She's teaching in the MELP program, and she's also teaching in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction in the College of Education and Human Development. And she's been a graduate assistant at CARLA working on the Learner Languages project. And so today the two of them are going to be talking to you. Their title of their talk is Exploring Spanish Learner Language, New CARLA Multimedia Activities. So please welcome Elaine and Shawna.
Thank you very much. And so what this is sort of the tail end of the summer for us. This is a project that we've been working on at CARLA for the whole year, and we finished this project in August, but nobody was here for us to report to. So I'm overlapping a little bit with the fall semester, trying to work with Shawna to tell you about this project that we completed, and hope that it's not too late to give us suggestions and as we work through this, but just to try to give you an idea of what we've been working on. So there's a handout that's going out. It has an outline of what we're going to be doing here today. This is an addition to the Learner Language website, which is shown up here on the screen. We originally, several years ago, established this site for teachers of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Persian Farsi. The idea is that second language acquisition research is really founded on looking at learners' language, and that this is kind of the core piece of this field that teachers need to know how to, not just know about, but really know how to do to some extent in their classroom. So the site is designed to show samples of learners of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Farsi doing different communication tasks, unrehearsed, and then taking those samples of learner language that are provided and guiding teachers through an error analysis, looking at developmental sequence in their language, looking at their interaction and acquisition in interaction, and looking at complexity in using various lenses. So that's basically what this is. So what we did over the last year was to add Spanish, and the original grant didn't let us do that. We've been wanting to do this for some time. So what you see here is the main page of our website. It talks about what is learner language. It talks about the communication tasks that were used. So on the Learner Language website, what you're seeing is a definition, what the communication tasks are, ways of looking at learner language, and then video recordings of learners using Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Persian, or Spanish in unrehearsed interaction. And this could be useful for teaching an SLA class. It's useful for teacher development and so on. It could be also useful for students themselves, looking at other students producing these languages. So what we're going to do today is talk to you about our project working with learners of Spanish. That's it, right. So we're going to turn this over to Shawna, and she's going to talk about who the learners were.
Great. Okay, so like Elaine said, in all of the previous languages that were used for this project. We had real learners come in to CARLA, had them perform communicative tasks, had it video recorded, had them transcribed, and then had the language analyzed. And that's the same thing we did with this installment with Spanish. So I would like to just take you in to Spanish. This is how you access it. You're going to click here. And I want to introduce you to our learners that we used for this installment of the Learn a Language project. So we're going to go into Learners. And before I even tell you anything about them, I want you to take a look. I'm going to show you down here. Or actually, I'll just go into all videos. I'm going to show you a video, just a clip of them interacting. And I want you to just watch and listen. And what comes to mind? And as you do so, try to think, what would their background be? What do you think the background of our learners are before I give you any information? So let's just take a peek at a short clip from one of our videos. This is a comparison task. And if any of you are familiar with the Learn a Language project or with the Tarone and Swearsman book, it's the same task. So they're comparing two houses. So they have photos of two different houses, and that's what they're comparing. Okay, so let's take a look.
Entonces tenemos que ver más o menos quién vive en cada casa. Creo que en mi casa lo que va a pasar es alguien más rico, sí, con más dinero.
Yo creo que la casa aquí es más una familia y porque una familia puede vivir en esta casa porque hay más espacio y creo que es un área más rico o con más dinero.
Más dinero.
Sí. Y es una casa más nueva, creo que sí.
All right. So just looking at this really quickly, obviously a short snapshot, what kind of thoughts, what are your first reactions as far as the background of these two learners based just on their oral proficiency, their oral Spanish that we're looking at here? You can just kind of shout out any ideas. Yeah, Marla.
I'm comfortable using Spanish. Yeah. Anything else? One has more of a more native like accent or production skills. A little bit more comfortable with articulation. All the other ones, okay.
I'm going to guess that the guy on the left there has some Spanish home language exposure, whereas the one on the right is clearly learning Spanish as a foreign language.
Okay.
Any other reactions, thoughts as to their background? Great. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, well, one of them obviously goes to the University of Minnesota and is proud of it.
Yeah. Okay. So, if you come into our website and look under Learners, as I have here, Activity 2 is what I'm going to show you now. We've got a simple table, very nifty little table, comparing and showing all of a simple profile of the characteristics of our learners with age and other possible pertinent characteristics. So I want you to look over these, comparing Henry and Raul. These are obviously pseudonyms, but those are the names of our learners here. And just looking over these, comparing what are the similarities and what are the differences that you see between our learners. And once you've had a chance, just kind of turn to a partner and talk about what the similarities and differences you see between our learners are. And then we'll bring it back together. So just take a minute or two to do that. right, so let's finish up our discussions. Okay. So let's bring it together again and share our thoughts. What do you see are similarities that our learners have? What do they share? Anything?
Gender.
Absolutely, they're both male. Thank you, Tara. Good, so they're both male, Even though that's not up there, obvious, yes?
Jonque said that they've been using Spanish for a long time.
Oh, thank you, Jonque and Martha. Kate?
They both have opportunities to speak Spanish outside of the classroom.
Absolutely. It's huge.
Relative age.
Yeah, roughly about the same age.
They've reached the same level of education, typically undergrad.
Yeah, so they're both undergrad, and we can probably assume by the age they're both upperclassmen, right? They both attend the same large Midwestern university, right? Right. Good. So beyond those similarities, also some pretty striking differences, right? What are the differences we see? Biggest one, maybe? Yeah, you.
One is a heritage Spanish speaker, the other is a foreign mentor.
Okay, we'll see. One has a native language. These are obviously self-reported. But for their native language, Henry said, they were asked in Spanish, what is your native language? Henry reported English, and Raul reported Spanish, right? And as you can see, it gets into a little more detail here. You can kind of pick out Raul's story here. So he was born and spent a lot of his childhood in a Cuernavaca suburb in Mexico. Until about age 8, he was in a completely Spanish-dominant environment. At age 8, he started learning English in Mexico, and he describes in his interview task, it was sort of like an after-school program type of thing. So he started learning English then, and about a year later, at age 9, he moved to the US. And at that point, he was really immersed, or I guess submersed really, in an English-dominant environment in school. It was conducted completely in English. He did talk about how he had some transitional help. So for example, he had cousins living in the US, and he would speak English with his cousins, which is really cool. And he also had one teacher that he specifically remembers going out of his way to help him with his ESL and really guiding him along with that transition. Okay, so definitely linguistic background is quite different as far as childhood. Anything else? Other differences you see?
Raul has had exposure to academic Spanish and also, exposure to highly proficient Spanish speakers with his parents, which is likely also linked to some level of academic Spanish, whereas Henry, it looks like most of his exposure is in a classroom, and it looks like most of it was focused on language, not a classroom where he was learning content.
Absolutely, yeah. So while Raul did have some, we could say, academic Spanish in that he was in school in Spanish through 3rd grade, yes, Henry would have an academic level all the way through K-12. So he does talk about in his interview, for example, he started Spanish in kindergarten, and it was sort of a, as we're probably familiar with the K-12 situation, 1 hour, teacher comes in, does some Spanish, and he says he really just preferred his K-12 learning environment as opposed to his current more communication-oriented classes at the university. So that's good. And yeah, absolutely. So with his academic background, one thing I wanted to touch on was with that native speaker contact. Raul talks about now, today, he says, no lo uso. I don't use Spanish. So he actually doesn't use it at all when it comes to work contexts or academic contexts. He talks to his parents about once a week, calls them up, and that's the only time he uses Spanish, which, like you said, would be very different, and the language itself would be very different from a student or a learner who's practicing it in an academic context every day, right? And yeah, and Henry, regular practice with native speaker roommates. He says he had one roommate who was pretty proficient, and so he'd try to, how's it going? Try to practice a little bit basic conversation with some speakers outside of class. But again, as you said, majority of his Spanish is going to be in a classroom setting. Yeah. Anything else? Any other differences we can see? Okay. So down below is our response, which is basically everything we just went over. But just so you know, that's where you would find it. And what I want to touch on now is this question about heritage learners. Okay. So is Raul a heritage learner? If you look in Learners Activity 4, we've got a whole activity on it here. And what this is, again, these whole activities are designed for teachers of Spanish, right, to hopefully come in and use our activities. And this would be one of them. So it includes a really brief, really brief summary of an overview of what is a heritage learner, mostly drawing off of Potowski 2014 in Gieslin's handbook, if anybody's familiar with that. So I want you to read this over quickly, and what do you think? Is Raul speaking as a foreign language learner, heritage learner, something else? Okay, so just take maybe 2 minutes, look it over, talk to a partner, feel free. So if you've had a chance to talk, think about it, what do you think? Would we consider, yeah, go ahead.
I think it's important that Raul considers himself a native speaker. And so I would be inclined to call him that rather than a heritage learner.
White? Anyone else?
I don't recall whether Valdez says that you stop becoming a heritage learner in her definition after a certain age when you, or if you stop using the language. I don't know if what she says about that.
Okay.
I don't know. Do you?
Great.
So that's one of my questions at the moment, to see if he's in this third category.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just not sure if Valdez would exclude him.
Yeah. So the after age of 12, does that
I'm sorry?
As an age of
12? Is that Potowski who's in the after age of 12?
Is that Valdez?
It looks like Potowski, that's what I said it was. So we can go back and check again on those specifics, but yeah. So this is where it becomes really problematic, right? Anybody else? Okay, good. Overall, I think the term heritage learner can be really problematic, right? So as you were saying, right, we need to take into account also what the speaker themselves think, what the learner identifies as, absolutely. And just from this alone, Raul doesn't really fit, right? He came before age 12. He doesn't use the language very much, but just his oral proficiency at least is very high. So what we talked about is how he really fits into this homeland Spanish speaker, or native, right? And if he identifies as native, absolutely. Yeah.
I think this points just to the complexity of these labels, with the heritage language, trying to classify who you are as a language learner is an almost impossible task on some level because it varies so much over the life cycle of any individual, speaker, right? So questions like, what does it mean to be a native speaker or a heritage learner? They're all a bit of a conundrum.
Absolutely, but at the same time when we have teachers teaching in K-12 schools, they also are saying, I have these students that don't really fit, right? The rest of my students, how do I deal with this? How do I teach them? Because they do have different needs, and they do have different things, different issues to address when it comes to working on their language, yeah.
We classified Raul as a language learner, though.
Ooh, well, we're going to talk more about that for the rest of the presentation.
He actually said about himself, he said, yes, I'm a native speaker, but also he said, I have some problems with my Spanish.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so he's pretty upfront about that. So he did identify his vocabulary, he said, was very, very limited, and he didn't feel comfortable speaking Spanish in most of his life. So he gave me an example of how he can talk about, childhood memories or where are you from, these kinds of things. He'd speak in Spanish, but as soon as you ask, what do you want to do for your job or your internship, what do you study, he cannot, he can't do that in Spanish, that he just has to switch to English, and it's very uncomfortable for him. So I don't know if that answers your question.
So in a way, I think he's got learner language in the sense that we're seeing him as not as having maybe some areas of his Spanish that are not as developed as others. So what are those? And I think that's the problem with heritage learner as a label. I think people use it because as teachers they'll say, I have these students that don't fit, they seem so fluent orally, but this class is not designed for that kind of learner. So what kind of learner is it developed for? It's for learners like Henry, right? And then there are all these other learners that increasingly are coming into our programs, and it's problematic to label them all heritage learner, but I think what might be more helpful is something more nuanced, like what can you do in your two languages? What are you comfortable talking about, writing about, reading about? Where do you feel your strengths are? Where do you feel you want to continue learning? And so language learner, because we are hoping that he will continue developing both of his languages. Aspiration on our part, perhaps. Although he did say he had that aspiration as well. One of the things that we did was we looked at their language from a number of different points of view, and you could pick up right away, I think, from just that little video snippet, that Henry his pronunciation is quite different from Raul's. So Henry's pronunciation has lots of traces of English pronunciation mixed into it, whereas Raul's doesn't seem to have that much. So that's something that you'll notice as you watch these videos if you get a chance. More and more, it would be an interesting exercise to take a look at ways in which the pronunciation of Henry is quite Anglo, whereas Raul's is not. And then, of course, there's been a lot of debate in the field about why that might be. They both were exposed to Spanish early, before the critical period, one more than others, but one has a pronunciation issue and the other one does not. We have activities looking at errors. Same thing if you go through and you have a chance to do that. We have transcripts, so you can look at the transcripts, you can listen. And there are some other kinds of anglicisms in Henry's speech, going beyond pronunciation. There are lots of errors that he makes that Raul doesn't make, and vice versa. I'd say overall, Henry makes more errors, so his accuracy is not as good as Raul's. But what we have time to do here, and all we have time to do, is to take a look at complexity. And here, what we're going to do is, and I've given you a handout here, what we had people do here is to do this task, and I'm going to ask Karen to pass these out. This is what we call the narrative task. So we had them both do the narrative task orally and then in writing. So what we're going to do is to take a look at these two individuals' oral narration of the story that's depicted here. It's some events that take place in a grocery store. And look at what they do orally and look what they do in writing in terms of linguistic complexity. Now, what would you predict? Right? You're all pretty much language teachers. You've all learned languages. What would you predict? Would you have any predictions about Henry's performance describing these pictures versus Raul's, in orally or in writing? Do you not want to stick your necks out, or? Yep, sure. Go ahead. Dan will do it.
Raul will be much more complex orally than Henry, and Henry may be more complex than Raul in writing.
And why would that be?
because Raul probably has most of his exposure to the languages oral and not written. And Henry has had experience sort of analyzing language and looking at language from a kind of a structural perspective.
Okay, that's one possibility. Others? Yep.
Tentatively, the native, the one who we were calling the heritage speaker, might be able to more describe relationships or interpersonal exchanges in a more sophisticated way. Whereas I would say if I have to put my money down, that Henry might just make it almost more of an academic description rather than kind of a story.
Excellent. Good. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I think that it's likely that Raul is going to have much more. His type token ratio is going to be much higher than Henry's. He's going to have a vocabulary advantage, especially because this is taking place at a store, a social context.
Okay, good. It's a sophisticated audience. Yes. One of the things we always do when we're working with teachers on this is not to just stop with one answer, by the way. There's always many different possibilities, and we really want to pull all the possibilities out on the table. And we do that when we're looking at the data, too, not just making predictions. I want you to flip over your handout and look at the data. So you have first the oral story in Spanish. Those of you who don't speak Spanish are going to have to look at what you can or work with someone who knows some Spanish. The second is the written version. So take a minute, see what you can see, and tell me what you think you're seeing here. And what we're then going to do is we're going to go through and we're going to do a type token ratio. We're going to look at vocabulary complexity, and we're going to look at syntactic complexity. Maybe the first thing that we ought to do is have you look at syntactic complexity. I was going to do it the other way around, but I think this will be faster. Take a look at the sentences. And one of the things that we do here, let me just come down to where we're actually doing this. This is activity 4 in complexity. So we first have people do a type token ratio. That's a way of looking at vocabulary and seeing how varied is the vocabulary. Do they use the same words over and over and over again, or do they mix it up? Do they use synonyms? Do they use a wider range of vocabulary to do the task? We look at type token at lexical variety in the written sample and in the oral sample. And then we can look at syntactic complexity. Scanning down. Here it is. There are lots of measures of syntactic complexity, but the simplest thing we thought is to look at how many complex sentences are there. So what's a complex sentence? It's clauses that are connected by anything in our data, anything other than and, or sentences that stand alone are simple sentences. So clauses connected by and are simple sentences. But if they have a but or a since, right, then we have a complex sentence. So look for examples, and here's some examples here. He remembered the girl who gave him the book in the station, so there are 2 clauses with a who. Or he remembered the girl, that's the Spanish version, right? He remembered the girl is simple. So look for examples in all the data and count the number of complex sentences there are for Henry and for Raul. And for those of you who don't speak Spanish, you're looking for words like pero, which is but, and que as a relative clause. And what are you seeing here? It's fairly clear. start with Raul. He has some relative clauses in his oral. Where do you see that? The line numbers. 9 and 10. The end of it, I think that what's going to happen is, that's a nice one. Going to find out that someone's taken the bottle. And in reality, it was the girl who grabbed the bottle and put it in the purse. So there's several complex sentences orally. What about in writing, in his written version? He did this right after. This was stunning, right? Actually, when Shawna found that she just listed the sentences one above the other. It's like simple sentence, simple sentence, simple sentence, simple sentence. We're like, wow, is this the same guy, right? Right? And he had told us he had, and this is of course as you predicted, as Dan predicted, right? How about Henry? What are you seeing there?
2 in oral.
2 in the oral. What lines?
Line 12 and line 13.
Mm-hmm.
K and 4K.
Mm-hmm. Basically, in line 12, she meets another woman who she knows, and possibly it's her daughter, because that's a great one. We like because she's younger than the first woman, right? So very nice, complex sentence. And how about in writing? 3. So if we look at the data, and Shawna went through and took a look at this. We're going to skip over the TTRs if we can for now. So you have on the left side, you have Henry. So 2 of his 5 sentences are complex orally, and 2 of the 4 in his written version are complex sentences. Whereas for Raul, 1 out of 5 is a complex sentence orally, and none of his written sentences is complex, right? So this is surprising, right? But it fits actually what he said. I mean, sometimes learners are very clear about what they feel their strengths are and what they aren't. And he said, well, you know, I'm much better orally, and I'm not so comfortable with my vocabulary, not with writing. Now, let's take a look at vocabulary. This is going to be trickier, so we have very little time. But one of the things that we do like to do on the website is teach teachers how to do a type token ratio. It's a simple way of taking a look at a text to look at variety of lexicon. It is not a golden bullet. It has a lot of problems, but it is a quick, fast, and easy way to just get a sense of how varied is the vocabulary. And it's easy. So basically you take the first, you count off on your page the first 50 words, and in the written version and in the oral version, and then you say those 50 words are the tokens. Then you go back and you say how many of those words were repeated. And I'm only going to count it once if it was repeated. So those are the types. So types are the number of unique words, and tokens are the number of total words. And just do 50. Usually we use more than 50 if we want to publish a paper, but this is just to show you how it works, right? And it's a kind of quick and dirty tool for a teacher to have to show students, for example, their progress in vocabulary. Something like that. It's a nice way to use this. But anyway, so do the same. Maybe one of you do Raul, the other do Henry, and just see what you can find in terms of variety of vocabulary. So the basic thing is once you have the types and the tokens, you divide the tokens into the types and you get a ratio. Faint text we've fixed for you, because what's a word? In oral language, what's a word? So you notice that we've faded out a lot of these words, right? And that's because we are not going to want to count So for us, a word is something that has meaning. So or pauses don't count. Also, spoken language is full of repetitions, so repeated words. So we're not going to count those false starts. We're not going to count, we're only going to count those once, because that's a feature of discourse and speech planning time. It's not a feature of vocabulary knowledge. That's what we're going to say. You can argue with us, but that is what we're going to say. And so we've faded out the ones don't count. Determiners count. Yeah, and people do this different ways depending on their theory or what they want to look at. You can just count content words if that's all you care about, but we're just going to do it the traditional way, which is just count the determiners, the prepositions, the content words. And you get into debates like, if it's a contraction, is that one word or is that two? The main thing when you're doing type token analysis is decide what you are and are not going to count and how you're going to count it, and be consistent. Because the whole purpose of this is to compare one to the other. You want to count it the same way for both of them and for both kinds of discourse. And you're going to find different counts, because depending on the criteria you use. It's not worth it arguing over which criterion is best. For teaching purposes, the main thing is be consistent. Whatever system you work out, be consistent. And what we're going to do, because we have a time limit and you may want to talk about other things, is we're going to just zoom right down and show you our calculation here for both of these. So you've seen this before. But our count for Henry, we counted 53 words, not 50 because of where the sentence ended. And 34 of those 53 words were unique, right? So he has a type token ratio of 64 on his oral, and in his writing, it's identical. His type token ratio is the same for these samples. Now we have other examples up on the website, longer ones, another task. It would not be unusual for it to be different, right? So this is just for this little sample, this is how it came out. Raul is very similar to Henry on his oral, is identical actually. His TTR is the same, it's 0.64, right? But in his writing, his vocabulary variety goes down, right? And these are surprising for both of us, because usually what we expect is in writing, you use more varied vocabulary in writing because you have more time to think about it, and especially if your teacher has stressed vocabulary variety is good. I want you to use as many words as you can, be descriptive. You know, you have time to use a wider variety of vocabulary in writing. But neither of these guys did, right? And in fact, Raul's went down. What are your thoughts about this? What do you think? There's more than one way of thinking about this. Yep.
It occurs to me that, they're not getting a grade for this. They're just doing it for, for you. And I could just see them just whipping something out, not really caring about how much they used. And probably both of them could have done a lot better on the writing task if there had been higher stakes.
If we had said, if we had given different instructions, this is the last task they did, and they'd been with us being video recorded for hours. So let me out of here, right? It could be that, absolutely. If we had said, we really are going to be looking at your vocabulary here on this task, give us the best vocabulary you can, I'm sure they would have. It would have looked a lot different. Yep.
I was also thinking about with Raul, he said that, he doesn't practice writing choose a simpler word that I feel more comfortable with.
That spelling thing is huge, and before we started doing these tasks, I've had a native speaker do that, right? The vocabulary variety went down in writing, and the reason was exactly this. I'm not a good speller, so I'm only using the words I know how to spell, right? And basically, this is handwritten. If we'd had them word process it, they could have used spell check, and we might have gotten a wider variety of vocabulary. I don't know if people who do language assessment think about these issues of word process versus handwritten. What is the impact of doing a handwritten essay? It's going to depress vocabulary variety. I'm willing now to bet money on it. Just because, and it happens with native speakers, not just with Raul here.
These transcriptions are accurate, right? I mean, it's not...
Oh, transcription is never, we don't use the word accurate for transcription. We use...
I mean the written transcription.
The written transcription...
What do you mean by accurate?
What do you mean by accurate?
Correct spelling.
No, no.
So they are what they wrote.
Yeah. But we've been talking about transcription in a class, and transcription is always a perceptual activity on the part of the transcriber. There's no such thing as an accurate transcription. It's what I heard you say, and somebody else might hear you say something different.
Well, I was talking about the written.
Okay, the written. Well, it was handwritten, and my reading of somebody's scrawl might be different than Shawna's. It's a little less, though, but yeah. Yeah?
You know, one of the things that I'm struck with is that as a measure of vocabulary, really the type-token ratio doesn't do justice.
Yes.
There's a significant difference in the level of sophistication of the word use.
Right.
between Raul and
Right. I mean, look at the vocabulary that Raul uses here. What are you picking up here that he's using? That
despensa.
Despensa, right.
That would be
Right.
one of the agarró.
Agarró.
Well, that's sophisticated, but it's all way more.
Platicando. Yeah. Charlando. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's been an issue also when we've tried to use TTR in other contexts, is it doesn't capture what you want to capture about academic language, let's say abstract words versus concrete. All it's doing is saying how much variety is there, and it can be very simple but varied. So that's an additional thing. And I think the hypothesis over here that you were going to predict that that the vocabulary was going to be of a certain type is not captured by the TTR. So you'd have to come back and say, people have done things like work with vocabulary, the first 1,000 words, second 1,000 words, third 1,000. As you get into the 6,000th word, you're getting into much more academic. So are these words drawn from the very frequent, common vocabulary, the first 1,000 words, or are they drawn from a 5,000 level? So that would be another way. And one of the things we try to do on this site is talk about, these measures are used in publications, they're used in SLA, but they're very restricted, right? They're just one lens, right? So can you look at the same data using more than one lens? And that's what we do, right? So we look at this as, let's look at this in terms of accuracy. This is the first thing that teachers want to look at is accuracy, right? But now let's look at it in terms of complexity. Now this looks really different, right? Or look at it in terms of willingness to co-construct an interaction. Both these guys were fantastic conversation partners. They scaffolded each other, they helped each other. So that's another feature that you want to see in your learners, right? So just trying to use a variety of different lenses to look at learner language is something that we want teachers to be able to come away with, to have a few tools at their disposal. Dan has consistently said in looking at this website, we should have learners come to these sites and not just teachers. And I'd love to do that. If I were continuing to be director of CARLA, I might. But, but maybe a graduate student would like to do that. You know, or Dan. Dan could do it, right? So, I mean, how could it's useful for students to look at other students and see how teachers are talking about their language, because then they turn that around and they have a sense of how to look at their own language. So this is a way that's the potential for this website that is there and waiting to be activated, but we haven't done that. That's about it. Are any other comments or thoughts about this website? I hope, yeah.
I have a question. I wondered if you guys have looked at all at self-correction, because I noticed that Raul self-corrects a lot. Whereas Henry just sort of repeats or says, but he's not really self-correcting. I mean, I don't speak Spanish, so I don't know if it's accurate or not. But I wondered if you looked at that.
We have not looked at that. It's another lens. It would be fascinating, especially in the accuracy part. In some of the activities we've done with teachers in looking at accuracy, there are some really interesting self-corrections. So when you're looking for the influence of the native language, for example, you'll see a learner starting to produce a native language word and stuttering and then going to the target language word, right? So when you're looking for the influence of native language, that's important to see, right? It isn't just what words are transferred, but what words start to get transferred and then get self-corrected away from that. So that's something also that we could have looked at. We just, there's a lot more to do here. Yeah, but, yeah.
Basic question you might have answered in the beginning, but were they in the same Spanish class?
No, they were not. Raul has never taken a Spanish class. He's never taken one at all. Not since he was 8 years old had he ever had Spanish in the classroom.
Say it again.
Oh, it's okay.
You got it? Okay. Yeah.
So I'm confused by the measures of complexity.
Mm-hmm.
It says in oral, 2 of the 5 sentences for Henry were complex and only 1 of the 5 for Raul. But I don't think that's accurate.
Oh, okay.
I think it's not accurate. I think
Okay.
because there are 2 different sentences in Raul that include that complexity. So there's the creo que lo que va a pasar es que la señora, and then the next one, pero en realidad fue la niña que agarró. So you definitely have 2 of his sentences.
In the oral. Okay, we'll go back.
Oral sentences are reflecting complexity.
Right.
Whereas really, if you go up and look at Henry, look at it by sentence, unless I'm not understanding how you counted sentences.
I know what's happening.
He uses the otra mujer que ella conoce posiblemente porque it's all in one sentence.
Yep.
So
What?
it actually would be flipped.
Yep.
So Henry would have used 1 of 5 and Raul 2 of 5.
Yeah. This is a very narrow window. We were counting just the first 53 words, but we gave you more, right? So basically our justification was just here's how to count, right? But we need a wider window here for these 2 guys, right? So we could go back and recount and say if you had a little bit larger sample, you might get a different picture. Because as with every lens you use to look at learner language, the narrowness of your focus is going to cause you to miss something if you expand it. This would be a really nice additional activity if you wanted to do it. Right? Okay. Okay.
So I think we'll do one more question, but then we'll have to wrap up.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I just thought that how would you recommend also for looking at like complexity of the storyline? Because what I think is so intriguing about Raul's that I would like my learners to be able to do is that he says, en realidad, when then, right, he goes back and forth. When they get to the end, they're going to think that lady stole it, but it was really her who, right? So that's a very native-like, right, a native speaker way to set up something.
And that's, and that's where the syntax gets complex too, right? As the storyline, as the thinking gets complex, it affects the syntax. And we just sampled the first 50 of his, and we missed that part. So where you sample. I think that's worth looking at, and people have been talking about how to do that. It's tricky, but I have a colleague, Bonnie Swersman at Hamlin, who's been trying to get a handle on that kind of complexity of meaning in story development. So that would be something some of our literary colleagues might have something to say about, because that's important, right?
I think that would be a great way for students to use this site. Look at
Yep.
that. We don't have the answer for how to analyze it, but imagine a student reading these and
Right.
comparing that.
Right.
Look how you would do
Yeah,
that
exactly.
in the beginning where you can catch that.
Exactly. And Raul has that and Henry doesn't. Right. So, I mean, in a way, this suggests that this is kind of a good reason to have such students working together, because their skills and strengths complement each other in certain ways. It suggests that pair work where you actually mixed learners like that might be a good idea to see what they can learn from each other. Okay, we'll stop. Thank you very much.
For coming. I'm sure Shawna and Elaine will be happy to continue the conversation if you have more questions. And please don't forget about our next talk on the 28th of September. We hope to see you there.